Welcome back to Changing America. In the last few weeks, we've heard 2016 candidates like Hillary Clinton and Rand Paul talk about the need for prison reform and a call to end mass incarceration. But something we haven't heard in this discussion is America's growing for-profit prison industry. Since the Reagan era, the for-profit industry has seen a massive increase in its revenue and its share of the prison population. The two largest for-profit prison companies are the GEO Group and the Corrections Corporation of America. Both companies have been given more than $10 million to candidates since 1989 and have spent more than $25 million in lobbying efforts. Today, these companies make a combined $3.3 billion annually, and part of the profits come from undocumented communities. That's right. Private prison companies nearly half the nation's house half the immigrants' detainees. In 2012, the Federal Bureau of Prisons paid these private companies $5 billion to detain undocumented immigrants. Since 2005, CCA and GEO have more than doubled their revenues from immigrant detention. Part of the increase comes from occupancy rates and political donations from border states with high populations of undocumented immigrants. These private companies' lobbying power is only growing as they mobilize and commoditize workers. Joining me to talk about the growing power of the for-profit prison industry is Thomas Sands, the president and general counsel for MALDEF. Thanks for joining me, Thomas.
Good to see you.
So, we often hear this whole idea of how do we end the prison incarceration, but we rarely talk, Tom, about the underbelly of where the latest population pipeline is actually coming from, and that is the undocumented immigrant. Talk to me a little bit about that.
Well, we've seen great increases in immigrant detention. This ranges from family detention centers, which are problematic in and of themselves, to the kinds of detention that's been used for decades, but amped up under the recent years of increased enforcement, where immigrants who are undocumented or may even be lawful permanent residents but who have done something or been accused of something that would render them removable from the country are being detained in facilities around the entire United States.
And there have been studies where you find that a lot of that these prison companies have actually had a hand in crafting some of the immigration laws, most recently the ones that happened in Arizona. How are local and state governments basically able to swallow that hard water, recognizing that the individuals that have a hand in making a profit on the backs of undocumented immigrants are actually crafting this legislation?
Well, I don't think that this issue has gotten the amount of attention that it should, and it starts with using the term private prisons, which I know you have not used, but it's used often in the media. I think it's a misnomer. These are not like private schools or private hospitals or private garbage collectors. These are those schools, hospitals, garbage collection. Those are services that are provided by the government, but also sometimes provided by private entities. There's no such thing as a private prison. No matter how much I may be concerned about an annoying neighbor or about a particular relative who I think may be in trouble, I can't go hire somebody to imprison them. Only the government can put someone in prison. So these are really government prisons, but they are being operated by private entities. What that also means is that these private corporations have one and only one customer. That's the government. A private school may decide it wants to become a charter school, therefore it has a government client, but it can also market to private parents and students who will buy their services and enroll in the private school. These private prisons don't have an option like that. Their only customer is government. So what can they do to increase their business?
Right, and in this case, their customers increasingly the undocumented community is what you're saying as well, correct?
It's increasingly the federal government, and that's their main customer. And so since government is their only customer, to increase their business, they have to change how government buys its services, how it detains people, increasing privatization, or the number of people that are being detained. And so you end up with these contracts, as you're aware, that have minimums, where the government, whether it's the federal government or a state government or a local government, is going to pay for a given number of beds, occupants, regardless of whether those beds are actually filled or not. This creates incentives to actually fill the beds, detain people.
And this is where it gets a little tricky, too. So there have been so many exposés that basically say that not only are these individuals incarcerated and that these private detention programs are in bed with the making of a lot of these immigration laws, but that they take this undocumented worker, basically penalize them for working in this country without documentation, but then have them be forced labor, more or less, through a volunteer worker program where they get paid $1 a day.
It's absolutely right. In the vast majority of cases, immigrant detention is not appropriate. Really, we use detention with respect to those who have been convicted of crimes or have been accused of serious crimes and are unable to or have not been offered bail. We do that to incapacitate them, prevent them from either committing another crime or prevent them from leaving the jurisdiction and not being prosecuted. Immigrant detention is something different entirely. There's no indication that the vast majority of those being detained are a danger to anyone in society. So there's really no reason to detain them as we do with those who have been convicted of crimes or accused of serious crimes. So you end up with a situation where folks who don't belong in detention as we've usually described it and used it in this country, who are there for months and even years without any prospect of being released into the community, even though there are absolutely no danger to the community whatsoever.
Well, and some of the stuff that I was reading was that many times they have to go into these volunteer work programs, again, on $1 to $3 a day, because oftentimes the food subsidies, the food that they're receiving isn't enough. The phone cards so that they can call their families is so inaccessible, basically charging up to $5 a minute. So all this stuff is basically under the guise of, we don't want your work, but actually we do through indentured servitude, and we'll pay you $1 a day. So not only are these prison industries actually making money off of the federal government, but they're also making money off of free labor.
I think, and they're exposing these detainees to really deplorable conditions that you've described, and beyond that, really not having what anyone would consider to be humanitarian conditions, particularly once again for folks who are not a danger to the community, who have not demonstrated that they are going to commit any crimes that would do violence to anyone in the community. They're not being punished per se, they're being detained. One would expect even more humane conditions in that kind of detention, and you simply don't see it. And it goes under the radar, so folks are not aware of the conditions that these immigrants are exposed to.
And I think that if the average American person actually knew what was happening in the family detention systems, where you have a mother and a child basically detained without due process, where you have children growing up in basically what many folks liken to the Japanese internment camps of the 1940s, it's not much different. So you have a whole generation growing up behind bars.
Yeah, I think the vast majority of the general public doesn't understand that we are imprisoning families, mothers and their children. That's why MALDEF and the National Hispanic Leadership Agenda have called for an end to family detention. There's no reason why families should be detained by the United States government. We really have not done this since the internment, as you've mentioned, and there's no reason for us to have it today. These folks should be processed and released to the community, even as their case for immigration relief moves forward.
Tom, thank you so much for the important work that you're doing at MALDEF. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.